Today, I'd like to tell you about my top 10 tips for writing technical English well. Number 1, you can't explain something if you don't understand it properly yourself. This is a very common problem. Maybe someone is short of time, doesn't quite understand some of the details or implications of the experiment they've done, or the design they've worked on, and then they get a bit stuck in the text. It's easy to think, well, I'm not sure about this part, make up something that sounds roughly right, and the result is a poor quality text because it's been written by someone who doesn't understand what's going on and doesn't understand what's important. So the first thing I'd say is when you want to write about a machine, perhaps something like this laboratory gas burner, you want to describe it, what it's made from, how it works, that kind of thing. The first thing to do is to make sure you understand it all yourself. And that goes for the vocabulary too. You'll have to decide what the best words are to describe particular components or perhaps processes, parts of processes in chemical engineering, maybe similar things, maybe functions in software, that kind of thing. And you want to decide in advance, well, what vocabulary am I going to use? It's all part of the research and preparation before you write the text. Number 2, think carefully about the structure of the text. In a text, the first sentence, the opening sentence, and the last sentence, the closing sentence, are particularly important. The first sentence usually says something about the topic of the text, what it's going to talk about, and it ought to give that in the right amount of detail, probably not too much, probably tell you about the direction of the text, what it's going to focus on, and the closing sentence often comes back and says, well, these were the most important points, maybe not in a dull and boring way, maybe it just states clearly these were the findings of the experiment, or this is the significance. And the thing here is the first sentence is like the bait. It tempts people to read the rest of the text. It tells them whether it's relevant to their work. And the last sentence is often the summary and the thing that will stick in their mind. Now, between those two, you need to figure out what logical route you're going to take so that you can neatly move from one topic to the next. So as far as possible, you can have a text that runs smoothly from A to B to C. You can group these things so you don't go B, A, C, D, B, A, and go all over the place like a drunken spider. You can group like things in a sentence. You can say, well, these two things are very similar, they're relevant to each other, I'll put them in one sentence. Or on a larger scale, you can say, well, these two things are similar, I'll put them in one paragraph. And then when you want to move from one content point to the next, you might want to start a new sentence or start a new paragraph. What I wouldn't advise that you do is to say at the start of the text, this text is about. In the first paragraph, I will describe. In the second paragraph, I will describe. This kind of thing is quite boring to read, to be honest. And if you structure the text so that it flows, so that it's intuitive and easy to understand, so that people don't even have to think about following it, it just happens naturally, then you don't need all these references to what you're going to do in the next section of the text, or to summarize it paragraph by paragraph. But thinking about the text structure is something that you should be doing all the way through the writing process, from the beginning, when you perhaps have bullet points, or when you start writing and you figure out what you want to say, and then you edit it, you change it, right through to the end when you're looking at the draft, then revising the draft and turning in the final version. Number 3, word order and sentence construction. These are a bit different in English from German, and you'll find that your normal word order in English is subject, verb, object. It is possible to do other things. It is possible to start a sentence with a preposition, say, which is quite a common thing to do in German. It is possible to start a sentence with a subordinate clause and then have a comma and then follow that with the main clause of the sentence. But these are less common in English, and I would say they should be the exception rather than the rule. So when you're not sure, stick to your simple subject, verb, object sentence structure. And the shorter you make your sentences, the simpler it is to write something that's grammatically correct as well. Another common mistake is joining two sentences together, two complete sentences, which each have a subject, a verb, and an object with a comma. This is called a comma splice, and it's wrong. You mustn't do it. The alternatives would be to join the sentences with a colon, if there's a very strong logical connection, so the second sentence results from the first. If it's perhaps a little softer and weaker and more open to interpretation, or the second part, the second sentence is maybe the second element of a list, that kind of thing, you could use a semicolon. So a semicolon is a dot at the top and a comma at the bottom, in contrast to the colon, which I just mentioned, which is two dots. Or you could use a dash, which is like a hyphen but longer. And in these cases, it's also important to notice or to mention that the second sentence then begins with a lowercase letter rather than an uppercase letter. I'll come back to capital letters in a moment. The last thing I'll mention at this stage is a very common mistake is to put a comma before the word that. So people will write, for example, "It is true that the machine is broken." And although you might pause at that point when you read the sentence out, you would never write a comma before the word that. That's wrong. Number 4, capital letters. Capital letters in English are quite simple. You don't need as many of them in English as you do in German. You need them at the start of a sentence, so following a full stop, but as we just mentioned, not following a colon, a semicolon, or a dash. You need them for people's names, for company names, and for brand names. And the only further point that I'll mention is when it comes to acronyms. Acronyms are essentially abbreviations that use the first letter of each word. So LED for light emitting diode. In this case, if you don't want to use dots after the L, the E, and the D to indicate that it's an abbreviation, then I suggest you capitalize it instead. And that's the way that LED, for example, is normally written. Number 5, don't join nouns together using hyphens. A good example here would be the noun washing machine. It's a device that you find in your house. Essentially, this noun consists of two words that are brought together to refer to one machine, but if you put washing -machine, that's wrong. Your two options in English are to either write washing machine, which is the correct option, or to push the two words together and to just have a single word with no space. You can't do it with washing machine, that would be wrong, but you could do it with a word like teamwork, for example. Teamwork, the work that people do together in a team, is just a single word. There are practically no words in English where you have a noun with a hyphen in the middle of it. One of The very few examples would be decision making, when it's a noun referring to the action or the process of decision making. Problem solving would be another. But to hyphenate something like washing machine would be wrong. Number 6, remember to include articles. A lot of people, if they begin a sentence with a singular noun, they'll write something like, bolt attaches the cover. This is wrong. The noun is singular, and in this case, it needs an article. An article is a word like a, an, or the. So you need to write, a bolt attaches the cover, or the bolt attaches the cover. I think this is mainly a problem among people who don't come from Germany, but instead they perhaps speak Chinese or Russian as a first language. If, however, the noun at the start of the sentence is in plural, so bolts attach the cover, that is acceptable to write it in plural without the article at the beginning, but it may not always be the best choice. If you want to refer to specific bolts that you've already mentioned in the text, then you'd write, the bolts attach the cover, or, for example, the 4 bolts attach the cover. Number 7, one word for one thing. I get a lot of students and they think it's fancy to refer to one component of a machine using 3 different words in 3 different paragraphs. They'll perhaps describe something as being a wheel in the first paragraph, and in the second paragraph it's a gear, and in the third paragraph it's a pulley. Don't do this. This is extremely confusing, and the chances are only one of those words is correct. Wheel, gear, and pulley are 3 completely different things. When we're talking about sounding fancy, I think this is the reason why many people write long sentences, the things that I've just suggested you shouldn't write. And it's also the reason, or one of the reasons, why people use a lot of connectors, like moreover and furthermore and because and therefore and whereby and hereby and things like that. Don't do this. If you write a text that's logically structured, so you've thought out your ideas, well, you've written it with a good understanding from the beginning, then you don't need these extra words in your text. And to pepper your text with words like therefore and moreover and things like that, when the logic in your text is bad and the structure in your text is bad, it's not going to fix it. So, one word, one thing, and try not to sound fancy. Number 8, this and that, and these and those. Now, these words are used to refer to objects that are either near and relevant and immediate, or distant and less relevant and remote. And a good example would be, perhaps you're looking out of the window and your colleague says to you, this car is red, but that car is blue. Now the implication is that the second car, that car, is further away. You can do the same thing when you're referring to ideas and plans. If you discuss some ideas in a meeting, and the last one you discussed, people don't like it, and someone says, this idea is bad, that refers back to the last idea you were talking about, back to the last thing in the discussion. Now, if you, for example, write a sentence like, the machine failed because it ran out of oil, and the next sentence is, that is unacceptable, it doesn't make sense in English, because you're expecting this sentence, which refers back to the previous sentence to use the word this, because there's not much distance between them and the thing that's being mentioned is very relevant. So it should be, the machine failed because it ran out of oil. This is unacceptable. The only exception there is perhaps when you want to be polite. If you say, this is unacceptable, that's a bit more direct and aggressive than saying, that is unacceptable in a personal discussion. Number 9, don't assume too much reader knowledge. Don't assume that your reader knows as much as you do, because normally you're writing about your own research work or about a design that you've worked on, something you're very familiar with, and it's easy to say, well, that's obvious, and to skip over explaining some of the more important things. If you do this, you'll find that people get to a part that they don't understand, and then usually they put the text down and they say, it's badly written, it's boring, I can't be bothered. So you have to be able to see the text from your reader's point of view. In English, we'll often say, you put on a different hat. You read the text in a different role. You read it from the point of view of someone external to your work or to your project. Some people find when they do this that it's useful to leave the text that they've written for a few days before they come back and read it again to see if it makes sense. Other people find that they like to change the font if they're working on the computer to make it look like it's a text from another person. Then they read it and they see if they can make sense of it without their own subject-specific knowledge or project-specific knowledge. There's a famous joke saying in English, assume makes an ass out of you and me. Don't assume that your reader knows as much as you do. And number 10, edit your text before you're done. This is very important because no one gets it right first time. Maybe some people get a fair text the first time they write, especially the ones who do a lot of preparation, who think about it very clearly. Some people, they don't like to do that, and they like to just to start writing, and then they like to change it all and chop it around and move this bit and then change the order and change the vocabulary and edit it lots and lots and lots and lots. If you think these two types of writer, they can be the ends of the spectrum, if you like. The type of person who does a great deal of planning at the beginning, you can think of as being the architect, the one who makes the plans and then builds something that's nearly perfect and doesn't need much editing. Or you can think of the person at the other end of the spectrum as being the gardener. The gardener, well, starts to grow some things but then sees some weeds in his garden and thinks, well, I need to dig these weeds out. I need to sort this out, and this plant, I don't like it there, so I'll move it around. It's the same thing with text. You need to find your own approach to editing texts. It may be that your editing takes place when you really only have bullet points and ideas at the beginning, if you're the architect, and it may be that it takes place throughout the writing process and continuing, and then you have a lot of editing still at the end if you're the gardener. But no one can get a text right first time. Everyone has to edit it. I remember there was a famous author who said the best way to write a great book is to write it once, then burn it, and write it again from memory. The idea being that if you write it again from memory, all of the unimportant parts will get forgotten, and you will already have benefited from going through this method of thinking through the ideas very deeply the first time you wrote it. Maybe a little bit exaggerated, but there's certainly some truth in it. So, those are my 10 top tips for writing good technical English. I hope you find them useful. In the next video, I'll come back to this here and give you your assignment for this week. Thanks for your attention. If you've got any questions, please send me an email.